This week we're exploring views of the afterlife according to the world's major religions, and that begins with a recognition of something that is shared across them, that being the concept of a soul. Now, the notion of a soul is deeply rooted in both Eastern and Western societies. In fact, it's one of the most enduring forms of human self-understanding. We must all reconcile bodily decay with some inner sense of life as consisting of more than simple bodily existence, which is why we tend to distinguish between the body and the soul. The emergence of biological sciences in the mid-19th century cast serious disbelief on the existence of a soul, but many still give credence to the concept of a soul underlying human nature and destiny. When we talk about the major world religions, people tend to focus only on the first three listed here, but I will also be including Hinduism and Buddhism, as you probably realize, since we are reading all three chapters from Davies this week. But there's also many more other religions besides the five that we'll be focusing on primarily in this course. Let's take a quick start with with Hinduism and Buddhism. So you read your chapter in Davies, which talks about Indian death rites. The religions of India hold a common belief in the transmigration of souls, by which they mean a life force must pass through many existences while obeying moral principles to yield increased benefits in an improved form of transmigration at its next cycle. The concepts of samsara and karma, therefore, provide the basic dynamics behind the caste system into which people are born, and the rules of which should be followed during life so that in the next life a better state can be achieved. So they define samsara as this process of reincarnation and transmigration, and karma are the moral advantages or disadvantages that accrue from the way a life is lived. In general, Hindus, Buddhists, and Sikhs believe that human identity has far-reaching consequences for death ritual, especially in cremation. They see different types of death having an influence on the cremation itself. For example, good deaths are said to burn easily and are seen as self-igniting and glowing with divine radiance, whereas bad deaths yield bodies that turn black and are hard to burn. This image we see here is of a thangka, which is just the word for painting, showing the ancient realms of samsara in Buddhist cosmology. There are the three good realms, the heavenly, the demigod, and the human, and the three evil realms, which are animals, ghosts, and the hellish realm. Samsara ends if a person attains nirvana, that is, they extinguish their desires and gain true insight into impermanence. And so you'll hear a bit more about this in the video for this week's activity. Focusing on Hinduism, Davies discusses the work of Jonathan Parry, who interprets cremation as the corpse rising from the pyre as smoke, then becoming clouds and rain that feed the crops and return to earth as sperm to produce the next generation. In this sense, death is transformed into something positive. Parry goes on to describe the individual as possessing two sorts of animating power: the obvious signs of life and the underlying existence of an individual. A person's breath or life force leaves their body at the time of death. The body-pervading breath, however, is not easily released and requires the skull to be cracked open. In fact, a woman is often not considered to be a widow until the skull of her husband has been cracked, because in a sense, he is still alive. Buddhists favor cremation for disposing of human remains because Buddha was cremated after his death in the 6th century BCE. His cremated remains were divided into 8 parts and distributed to different regions, where the pots containing his remains were placed inside mounds called stupas. Stupas represent the mandala in 3D architecture, and the mandala, if you're not aware, is a condensed set of symbols reflecting on the nature of the cosmos and of the life and nature of the Buddha. Some interpret stupas as an axis mundi, or the world tree. If you remember to the last module, we talked about that concept in terms of Native American religions. This is, a sort of pan-world concept that we see popping up in many different places and at many different points in time. Stupas are the focus of devotion and piety for many Buddhists in the form of architecture as well as art. So in this case, they become symbols that the bitterness of life can be overcome, and this provides people with a sense of hope. Judaism is one of the most ancient religions in the world, dating about 1,000 years before the Christian era. In this sense, its key ideas have deeply influenced both Christianity and Islam. Now, the Talmud, which is the central text of Rabbinic Judaism, is also a primary source of Jewish religious law and theology. It serves as the guide for the daily life of Jews. This book has a major emphasis that lies on the resurrection of the body and not upon an immortal soul. Jews did not develop beliefs about life after death until the Middle Ages. Even then, it was a shift in focus rather than a complete abandonment of the idea of resurrection. Belief in resurrection, however, was transformed by early Christianity and made international, which left Judaism with a relatively narrow cultural boundaries. Your textbook outlines David Kramer's study of death in Judaism, in which he explains some Jewish funerary rites as grounded in the awareness of the corpse. For example, the corpse is visited 3 days after its death to be anointed with oils as a form of comfort to the dead in their new circumstances. Mourners should not engage in activities that remind the dead of the loss that they have incurred. And survivors are not to mourn until the body has been buried, because the deceased's needs must be met first. Bottom line is that Jews seem to think the soul hangs around the body for a while. Even the word for headstone means soul. Early practices of mourning included not washing, not wearing shoes, not having sex, turning chairs upside down, and not working. And these practices were intended to bring the mourner into a sympathetic relationship with the dead, whose own world had been disrupted and turned upside down. Nowadays, many Jews practice what's called Shiva. This is 7 days of mourning, during which they might, wear torn clothing, they don't shave, they sit in low seats, as you can see in the figure here. And this is followed by a 30-day period of lesser mourning as well. In Judaism, the main focus is on life rather than on death and doctrines of death. Where belief in an afterlife exists, the death rites are believed to aid the progress of the soul to its rest and peace with God, while for secular Jews, the emphasis falls upon the memory of the dead and the comfort of the survivors. Under Islam, Muslims believe that Allah creates people from the clay, sustains them, causes them to die, and finally calls them from their graves. This belief in a resurrection is very firmly established, so cremation is opposed within Islam. Shahada, which is the sacred utterance that there is no God but God and that Muhammad is his prophet, is proclaimed at both the birth and again at the death of an individual. So you enter the world and exit the world with under this same utterance. And that is what we see depicted in the bottom right here in Arabic. Burial rites in Islam focus on a people under God rather than the individual who now passes into an interim state prior to the afterlife of heaven or hell. The deceased is visited by 2 angels shortly after burial to interrogate them about their faith. And the soul is painfully withdrawn from the body part by part, so the family and community try to relieve this pain through the recitation of sacred scripture and prayers that generate a form of merit that can be transferred to the dead. This commonality of ideas of merit with those in both Buddhism and Christianity is important to recognize, but it's also depicted and managed in very different ways. According to Clifford Geertz, who is a pretty famous anthropologist and did some work in Morocco for several years, Islamic afterlife beliefs involve 3 separate notions that are often held congruently by the same individual. These 3 notions are, first, the idea of death, resurrection, and award or punishment in heaven. The second being a simple extinction at death, and the final one being the notion of reincarnation, which they tend to believe often occurs within the same family. What this illustrates is that the complexity of mixed beliefs is likely widespread, not only within Islam, but across all religions, and this is important because it allows the individual to choose a perspective that answers their needs. In this way, local religions furnish an extensive pool of orientation to overcome the idea of death, because as we've seen over and over again, we as humans tend to fear death, and having our own way to overcome and face that fear is going to be very important. Finally, there's Christianity, which is the most successful community-focused adaptation to death known to humanity in terms of the number and variety of cultures in which it has come to operate. Many have explored the centrality of Christ's death as a means of understanding both the human predicament and human destiny. set in the light of Jewish scriptural belief in sacrifices for sin. Just as animals were killed in the temple as sacrificial offerings to God, so the shedding of Jesus' blood through crucifixion is interpreted as a sacrifice for sin. The practice of transubstantiation, which according to the Roman Catholic Church, is the Eucharistic offering of bread and wine that are changed into the body and blood of Christ. This doctrine triggers many pious rites that are associated with the symbols of the sacrament, rooted in the repetition of Jesus' death at each Mass. Within Christianity, death is linked to morality through the idea of sin, which was the result of human disobedience. Atonement, therefore, is the belief that Jesus' death restored the relationship between God and humanity. The divine transformation of Jesus' body through resurrection broke the link between sin and death and promised the future resurrection of believers. Resurrection was and is the mode of entry into a heavenly domain where salvation would be fully known. This deeply held belief solidified burial as the preferred funerary rite among early Christians. Adoption of this belief over time can be seen in burial patterns of Roman cemeteries. Early on, we see pretty much all cremations, a gradual shift over time into equal parts of cremation and inhumations, and then finally we're only seeing inhumations. And so this isn't an immediate switch, like a light switch. We're seeing this gradual shift over time. Davies mentions the work of Knock, who has contended that this change in Roman burial practice was actually more of a change of fashion by the rich that was eventually adopted by the poor. And later on, the Roman Catholic Church sort of jumped on this as a way of ensuring that they wanted inhumation to be the practice going forward. Cremation, however, has crept its way back into Christian thinking, with various expressions of that across different traditions. Amongst Orthodox cultures, there's a continued rejection. The body must be preserved so that it can be completely resurrected. Among the Roman Catholics, this was a change over time from a complete rejection to some acceptance within the mid-1960s, And Anglicans have had a longer acceptance of cremation, which is a practice that was also then followed up by Protestants. In Europe, we see that cremation tends to demarcate between Protestants and Catholics, and there's a section within Davies that discusses some examples of different countries and their most common religions in terms of their cremation practices and just differences in how the cremations proceed. So I'll leave that in the reading for you to look at. The last piece I want to leave you with in the lecture for this week is Zoroastrian excarnation. So the beginning of chapter 5 gets into this a little bit. This is another Eastern tradition coming out more of the Middle East. They believe that death is ritually polluting. So rather than cremate them or bury bodies, they actually expose the bodies to the elements in order for them to decay so that they can avoid the contamination of the soil by the corpses. And so this process of decomposition is assisted by birds and scavengers. The bodies were often left in the Tower of Silence, a dogma, where they would be left out to the elements to decompose, and then you can see this central area in the middle of these circular structures where the bones would eventually just kind of be brushed into the middle. I've included a podcast, well, at least a brief clip from NPR that talks about a modern example because of a lack of vultures to help in this process and trying to overcome the sort of difficulty of Zoroastrians in the modern age. So I hope you enjoy that.